being young Pokémon nodded and I smiled kindly at her. Oddish. Misty felt her eyes grow watery again but she simply brushed her hand over them and sniffled. Thank you Oddish, that means a lot to me. The pre-evolved form of Gloom offered her yet another smile and then turned and headed over to where Bulbasaur was standing. Then, in a move no one was expecting, Oddish leapt up into Ash's lap and just settled down there with a content look on its face. Melanie was stunned seeing such a thing. That is amazing. Oddish didn't even take to me like that at first. Ash must really have a way with Pokémon. Brock and Misty simply looked at each other and smirked before the latter shook her head in amusement. You have no idea. Giselle, for her part, was just staring at the young rookie with unabashed admiration alight in her eyes. Concerning the ongoing conversation, Bulbasaur was now listening to the adoring and selfless things Pikachu was telling him about Ash with genuinely intrigued attentiveness. So much so that he didn't even notice when the boy in question slowly reached his hand out and gently touched his palm to the grass type's forehead. Neither he, nor the amber-eyed trainer now touching him, noticed the white mark suddenly appearing on Ash's palm as it made contact with his skin. The next thing that happened surprised everyone watching since, as soon as the boy touched Bulbasaur, a bright light erupted between them and blinded all others who were present. For Ash, it was like he was going through that same experience he had with Pikachu in Professor Oak's lab before they left to start their journey. Looking down at himself, he saw that he was glowing white and that Bulbasaur was in a similar state, except his own aura was yellow. Their surroundings had also changed. While he could still see the forest, the cottage and even his friends, Ash came to the realization that everything seemed to be frozen. As if time had ceased ticking. Moreover, the surrounding environment all seemed to have a faint, starry haze around it. Even stranger than that, the others were all frozen in states of mid-expression, almost as if they were made of wax. Even Pikachu was still as a statue next to his trainer. This is messed up. The boy murmured aloud as he looked at his glowing form and then back at their frozen surroundings. I really need to ask Arceus next time I see her what this is. Something tells me this has something to do with her, I'd bet my bottom credit on it. He then looked down at Bulbasaur but when he tried to speak, nothing came out. Instead, he could hear what he wanted to say coming from his mind, audibly. Almost like a form of telepathy. Everything's gonna be okay Bulbasaur, don't worry. This has happened before to me with Pikachu and it ended after I placed my hand on him. I know you don't really trust people but I need you to trust me just this once, okay? I promise I won't hurt you. After considering it for several long moments, the mistrustful grass type finally gave a tense nod. Smiling, Ash reached out and gently touched his hand to the Pokémon's forehead. Almost as soon as they came in contact, he felt the world around them fall away and a rapid barrage of scenes, which must have been memories, passed through his mind's eye. The first thing he saw was that of Bulbasaur, as a baby, playing with his litter mates while a mother Venusaur looked on nearby with paternal affection and love for her young. For Ash, it was almost as though he could feel the emotions associated with the memory. Love, happiness, joy and peace. However, the next scene he saw was a much less pleasant one. All at once, the montage of happy memories were replaced with emotions of terror, fear and turmoil as he witnessed Bulbasaur's litter mates and mother getting captured by a group of Pokémon poachers. He could feel the powerful rush of panic, yet also great anger from Bulbasaur as the brave little Pokémon tried to help his mother fight off the criminals, only for her to chase him away in the hope that he might save himself. Ash was nearly suffocated when he felt the memory of Bulbasaur's grief and heartache as he crouched within a cluster of shrubs, watching the poachers carry away his mother and siblings in a large truck. Suddenly, the scene shifted to that of a slightly more grown Bulbasaur venturing through the wilderness alone, consumed by guilt, anger and grief. It was like Ash was actually there as he watched the orphaned grass type try to keep himself warm in the cold of the night by sheltering in hollowed-out trees, all alone and shivering. Once again the memory montage changed and he witnessed Bulbasaur fight many opponents much bigger and stronger than himself, struggling for his very survival. Even though he took harsh beatings and attained many scars, he still fought bravely and never backed down. Through all of the many emotions Ash felt in all he had thus far seen, the most overwhelming desire he felt from Bulbasaur was an unyielding hunger for power and to become strong. To become strong enough to avenge his family and somehow take revenge on the poachers who took them away. Eventually, Ash witnessed Bulbasaur meet a trainer who he thought he could trust and help him become stronger. During his time with the long-haired looking teenager, Bulbasaur fought with all his heart and soul each match they undertook. Unfortunately, his trainer didn't know how to train Pokémon properly and therefore, he lost every battle. Quite naturally, the neglectful young man blamed Bulbasaur and before long, Ash was once again experiencing the grass type's pain as his trainer abandoned him in the very forest they were in now. Delia's son watched with tears building in his eyes as Bulbasaur waited for days in the same spot for his trainer to return. He felt the worry Bulbasaur had felt when he thought something bad had happened to his trainer and then the bitter realization that he had been abandoned. All culminating into heartbreaking sorrow and a complete loss of trust he had for people. The last memory Ash saw was Bulbasaur wandering through the forest, weak and completely despondent, before he finally collapsed. He then beheld, through Bulbasaur's eyes, the kindly smiling face of Melanie as she gently picked him up and carried him back to her cottage. When the connection finally ended and they returned to reality, Ash just sat back and stared at Bulbasaur. The small green Pokémon had an ashamed look on his face and the boy knew that it was because he had just practically seen all of his life in mere moments. His entire past laid bare before the young Ketchum's eyes. The tender-hearted boy leaned forward and looked down at the abandoned Pokémon softly, his gaze radiating both understanding and sympathy. Bulbasaur. I'm sorry for all you went through. I get it now. I understand why you don't trust humans, I really do. You've been hurt so many times before. He put a hand on his knee and shook his head. You didn't deserve any of that. From what I saw, you are an incredibly talented and skillful Pokémon. You've just never had a trainer who was willing to give you the attention and training you deserve. That jerk wasn't worthy of a Pokémon like you, you're worth 10 of him. The protector of the hidden village, of sorts looked up at Ash in genuine surprise, the sincerity in the boy's words ringing deep down somewhere in his heart. Eventually though, he looked back down and turned around before walking off to be on his own. Ash just sighed and stood up before turning to face his friends and Melanie, all of whom were staring at him in amazement. He seemed confused at the looks they were giving him at first until, eventually, he realized that they must have seen what had happened between he and Bulbasaur. Ash, what was that? Misty asked in utter bewilderment. The other three stared at him as well, hoping for an answer. He simply scratched the back of his head and then gave a small shrug. Well guys, to be honest, I don't know what happened between me and Bulbasaur. It's only taken place one other time and that was when I first got Pikachu. While their curiosity had not been sated, they understood that there was no point in pressing an issue which Ash couldn't even understand himself. So, even though the question still lingered heavily, they moved on. In fact, it was Melanie herself who soon switched topics entirely. Well, I know you four are just passing through, but why not stay the night here at my cottage? There's more than enough room and you can get a fresh start tomorrow. You won't be able to make it out of the forest anyway before nightfall if you left now. Seeing the wisdom in accepting the kind offer, Ash and his friends gratefully took the invitation and then went about settling down for the rest of the day. Soon, they were releasing their Pokémon for a little fresh air with Misty joining her own by the pond. Giselle sat by the front steps of the cabin, where Brock was busy discussing natural healing remedies with Melanie. Ash, for his part, went to train with his Pokémon. Which ended up being a rather interesting endeavor indeed since all of Melanie's rescue Pokémon watched them with rapt attention while they trained. Especially Bulbasaur. After his own exercises were finished, the now sweaty young man walked over to where the formerly injured and abandoned Pokémon were congregated and smiled at them. Do you guys like the way me and my Pokémon trained together? Each of them gave some form of positive affirmation, mainly in a nod or vocalization, and he responded in kind by holding his arms out. Well, hey, if you want, you can join us. While initially quite surprised at his offer, the small group of Pokémon agreed and joined Ash's team in their training. Albeit, mostly the general physical conditioning rather than anything specific. Quite naturally, of course, since he really knew nothing about any of them. For his friends and Melanie, who were now watching, it was indeed a sight to behold to see Ash so easily working with Pokémon that were not even his as they all trained. He was even able to give Staryu and Magikarp a few basic but effective movements to perform in the pond. Impressive in its own right since he had no water types himself as of yet. After the training session was finally over, Ash took in the sight of the unclaimed Pokémon before him. In a quite humorous spectacle, all of them were laying around in varying states of exhaustion. Even Magikarp seemed to be floating very nearly on its side in the water. The difference between them and his own Pokémon was quite obvious. Pikachu and the others were already mostly recovered and ready for dinner while the village Pokémon appeared ready to pass out from sheer exhaustion. Still, there was no denying that each and every one of them had heart. And plenty of it. One thing Ash could tell by watching them all train was that they had great potential. From the two Rattata, Paris and Weepinbell, all the way down to Caterpie and even Oddish, not one had any less apt capability than the other. Especially Bulbasaur. While he had trained at a relative distance from the rest, the grass type in question had a visibly burning desire to become stronger. Ash could see it in practically every single movement he performed. Seeing the passion Bulbasaur possessed firsthand once more caused Ash to simply shake his head in a mixture of disappointment and anger that his worthless former trainer didn't see the potential he so obviously held within. Once their short time of rest at the hidden village had ended, Ash and his friends prepared to head out once more. It was in the midst of their packing up when Melanie spoke. I just want to say thank you to all of you for visiting. Living so far out here, we rarely ever get peaceable guests. She then turned to the pupil of Professor Oak. And thank you, Ash, for being so nice to the Pokémon and letting them train with you. It will do them well to know that there are good Pokémon trainers out there. He looked at the Pokémon in question, all of whom seemed to have sad expressions that they were leaving. He was just about to say something on the matter when, all of a sudden, a powerful gust of wind went blowing through the clearing. The force of which was so great it sent all of them falling to the ground. What's happening? Giselle yelled over the windstorm just as they all looked up into the sky and saw a massive flying machine cresting over the clear horizon. The anomalous object in question had a big red R on the front and was made all of metal, appearing in design to almost resemble a gigantic sports stadium. It was powered and given flight by jet engine quality air turbines, which were causing the unnatural windstorm. As they stared at the massive flying vehicle, the top of the machine eventually opened up and brought Jessie, James and Meowth into view on a risen platform. Team Rocket. Ash and his friends announced in tandem, which caused the villainous trio to laugh maniacally. However, just when they were about begin their maddeningly terrible motto, Ash interrupted by yelling over the windstorm. Why are you three here? Ain't it obvious? Meowth yelled back. We're here to pluck all dem Pokémon and nab ya Pikachu while we're at it. He grinned toothily and gestured down at the machine they were standing on. And we got our fancy new Stadium Snatcher 5000 to help us do it. Like all of Team Rocket's best stuff, alls you gotta do is shrink it and carry it around in ya pocket, to expand it to full size when ya gotta use it. Works like a charm. James gave a haughty laugh and crossed his arms. It wasn't easy finding an open space big enough in this forest to make it grow, but it'll have been worth it to steal of those Pokémon with you. Not on your lives, you crooks. The boy angrily responded with Pikachu doing so likewise. Pie Pikachu pie. We deserve it after everything we went through to get here. Jessie growled back with a raised fist. Pit hole after pit hole, net after net. I broke a nail struggling to get out of one of those traps and I'm not leaving until I get something for it. She then pointed at James and barked, "Do it now." With a smirk, the blue-haired man held up a small control box with a red button and pressed it. Some people might say we suck, but I resent that. The front of the machine opened up and out from it came a long, metallic vacuum hose. As it extended and came within 30 feet or so from the ground, a powerfully suctioning force of air commenced. One in which no one was prepared for. With little to no effort, Pikachu was swiftly pulled right off of Ash's shoulder, followed by almost every single one of the village Pokémon also getting caught up in the artificial vacuum of air. Pikachu. The electric mouse's trainer yelled after him. Pika Pee. Pikachu cried out as he was sucked straight up into the machine along with everyone else, struggling all the way. Ash then looked over and saw Bulbasaur rooting himself to the ground as best as he could against the force of the vacuum's pull. Great strain was visible on his face as he fought to keep Oddish from being sucked away as well by keeping his vines wrapped around his friend. Moving to aid the brave grass-type's efforts, Ash ran against the windstorm and leapt into the air, arms outstretched. He just managed to grab hold of Oddish and pulled the small Pokémon down out of the air, rolling across the ground until he was right next to Bulbasaur. With Oddish tucked safely into his side, he threw his body down over the other grass type and held onto both of them tightly. He did so just in the nick of time too, since the vacuum soon had its way and sucked the three of them inside of its metallic maw. Ash. His friends and Melanie shouted as they watched he and the last of the Pokémon disappear into the machine. Air. I think we just acquired a twerp. James blinked just as Meowth leapt up and snatched the control box away from him. Hey, who cares? We'll get rid of him after we give da Pokémon to da boss. Well, get us out of here then, Meowth. Jessie demanded before crossing her arms and huffing. I need a shower after romping through the dirty forest all day. At that very moment, they heard something hitting the airship and looked down to see Brock's Graveler and Onyx throwing rocks at them, aided by Giselle's own Graveler doing the same, while Cubone repeatedly tossed his bone club at the machine. At the same time, Misty's Starmie, Staryu and Goldeen were firing blasts of water at them. All three rockets began laughing at the sight, with Jessie stopping only long enough to mock them. Do you honestly think that will stop us? Foolish little twerps, it'll take a lot more than that to destroy this airship. Meanwhile, in the belly of the metallic beast, inside of a cylindrical container that served as a cage, Ash was gathered in a huddle with all of the captured Pokémon. Is everybody okay? He asked in concern, getting nods and positive sound-offs in reply. Nodding, the boy became serious and shifted his position a bit. Good, then we need to find a way to get out of here. He then looked around the metal container they were in closely and soon spotted an air vent. Well, at least Team Rocket was mindful about them not suffocating. Smiling at the sight as inspiration struck, Ash looked at Pikachu. Hey buddy, do you think you can use Iron Tail on that vent grate and open it for us? The spunky electric type nodded and then ran up to the vent before jumping and striking the metallic covering with one steel-hard blow from his tail. The barrier stood no chance and easily shattered apart, leaving a hole that was just big enough for a Pokémon to fit through. Ash then looked at Bulbasaur and pointed at the open vent. Do you think you can get yourself and Pikachu up there if I give you a boost, Bulbasaur? Bulba. The hardy grass type answered in reply. With that, Ash lifted both he and Pikachu up and allowed them to use him as a platform to get inside the vent. Once they were in, he called up after them. Alright, now follow the ductwork until you find the control room. Once you locate it, destroy everything that looks important and bring this thing down. The two Pokémon of different types both nodded in understanding at his instructions and then took off through the ventilation shaft. After only a few minutes of traversing the metal maze, they soon came upon an exit grate blocking their way. With yet another powerful tail strike from Pikachu, it blew inward and allowed them access out of the vent. Together, they entered into a big circular room filled with computers, monitors and other machinery that, while alien to their Pokémon minds, nevertheless did indeed seem important. Therefore, with their orders clearly given, the Grass and Electric type duo went to work and started using their individual attacks to destroy everything in sight. Hearing the sound of loud explosions and, more so than that, feeling the entire aircraft shaking from within, all three rockets immediately looked at one another. What was that? James panicked, his eyes going wide as the shaking grew worse. I don't know, Meowth. Jessie looked down at their furry compatriot. Go see what's happening. Hurried into action by a combination of Jessie's angry tone and the increasing intensity of the shaking of the airship, Meowth quickly disappeared via the same raising platform they had appeared on. In the span of only a minute, he once more reappeared looking utterly terrified. We gotta get outta here. This thing's gonna blow. What? His teammates yelled in tandem. Da entire control room's destroyed. Probably da twerp's doin', he replied while scurrying over to them. At that very moment the loudest explosion yet rocked the floating airship. Just underneath of it a large hole was suddenly blown straight through the metal exterior from the inside before. From that now gaping opening, came the Pokémon who had just been captured. Since the rocket sky machine was quite some ways off the ground, Ash had to direct the Pokémon to jump down into the nearest tree. He himself, meanwhile, grabbed onto Magikarp since such a leap would have been all but impossible for the powerless fish. As soon as both Rattata, Caterpie, Paris, Staryu and Weepinbell had made it safely out of the machine, Bulbasaur jumped down lastly into the treetop with Oddish held up in his vines. Nodding for Pikachu to make the leap as well, which he did, Ash tightened his hold on Magikarp and followed suit. Thankfully, his aim was right on the money and his feet touched down on a thick branch that was easily able to support his weight. As the boy and the troop of Pokémon with him began making their way down out of the tree quickly, with Brock and the others cheering them on from over at the cottage, Jessie practically roared in an enraged tone. No. We stole those Pokémon fair and square. They can't do this to us, it's not fair. James, however, far more nervous than she was angry, tapped her arm. Jessie. I think we should get out of here while we still can. Yeah, or we're really gonna get blasted off straight to da moon. Meowth yelped while waving his furry arms around. Just as the villainous trio were about to make an attempt at escaping, Ash finally reached the ground with the Pokémon and yelled out to them. Wait just a minute, you crooks. You're not going anywhere. He then looked down at Pikachu and pointed up at the massive flying machine. Use a maximum power thunderbolt and send M to the scrap heap, buddy. Smirking, the little yellow mouse started to charge up his power before releasing it a few seconds later in a gigantic bolt of thunder with a loud cry of, Pikaaaaaaa. No. Jessie, James and Meowth wailed in terror as the fierce lightning bolt struck the machine and lit up in a bright yellow glow. The foiled criminals knew in that moment the electrifying error of their ways as they were painfully fried until stars began to pop in their eyes. Finally, in only a span of a few tortuous seconds, the internal damage combined with the overwhelming external attack caused the entire machine to explode. Black smoke was sent like a great dark cloud up into the air, and from that plume came the three speeding and soot-covered forms of the rocket trio. How did we lose again? This has to be some kind of a cheap trick. Jessie fumed. Let's not tell headquarters what happened to the machine. James gulped fearfully. This is what happens when y'all let a human pilot da craft. Meowth growled in disgust and crossed his arms under him just before all of them sounded out together. Re-blasting off AGAAAAIN. Smirking after them, Ash swiped a finger under his nose and chuckled. Man, I never get tired of seeing that. He then looked down at the Pokémon he had rescued and smiled. You guys okay? He received a loud chorus of affirmative replies and, Before long, a heavy mass of speeding weight suddenly collided into him, almost knocking him down. "Oh Ash, I'm so glad you're okay." Giselle gushed as she hugged the boy tightly. Gasping a bit for air as she squeezed him, he gave her back a light pat and wheezed. "I'm fine." Giselle, looking quite perturbed at the sight, Misty called out as she and the others walked up to them. "If you don't let him go, he's gonna suffocate." The brunette quickly let him go as she realized, with a noticeably red face, what she was doing. "Oh. Sorry Ash." She apologized while stepping back and shifting awkwardly from side to side. "No, it's fine," he replied, his own marked cheeks appearing just the faintest shade of red. Though the awkward moment was soon broken by Brock and the others as they reached them. "Man, you had us worried," the elder boy exclaimed as he put his hands on his hips. "We thought you guys were goners when you got sucked into that machine like that. I was so scared, I was afraid something terrible had happened to you." Melanie fretted with a hand held to her cheek. She then looked down at the Pokémon she cared and knelt down, holding her arms out. "Oh, I'm so glad you're all okay." They all quickly ran into her arms while Ash, still holding Magikarp, chuckled. "Team Rocket'll never learn. They were really brave, didn't freak out even a little bit when we were trapped in that thing." The blue-haired woman looked up and smiled gratefully at the boy. "Ash." She finally stood and held her hand up to her heart. "I cannot thank you enough for what you did. That was without a doubt the bravest and most selfless thing I have ever seen. The way you threw yourself into harm's way like that, just for Pokémon you've never met before, it was amazing." "It was no big deal, Melanie. I was just glad I was able to save them," he responded modestly, rubbing the back of his neck. Suddenly, he heard the sound of Bulba, and glanced down to see the grass type in question looking up at him intently. Bulba. Bulbasaur. At first, Ash seemed a little confused as to what the headstrong Pokémon wanted, but eventually, after pondering on it for a few moments, he somehow began to understand. It was a strange thing, but, for some reason, whenever he used the odd mark on his hand to empathically communicate with Pokémon, he began developing an ability to more easily understand that particular Pokémon in general. It worked with Pikachu, and he believed that the same thing was happening now for Bulbasaur. As the fiery grass type backed away and began scratching at the ground in a combative manner, though, it became no secret to anyone what he wanted. "Bulba. Bulba Bulba Bulbasaur," he repeated a few times, further seeking to drive his intentions home. "What's he trying to say?" Giselle questioned. Melanie was the one who decided to take a stab at what might have been happening. "I think it might be possible that Bulbasaur wants to battle you, Ash. And maybe he is offering himself up as a prize if he loses." Bulbasaur looked back at her and nodded, showing that she had been right after all. This shocked Ash and he was forced to repeat it just to be sure. "So wait. Bulbasaur wants to battle us, and if he loses, he'll come along with me." At that, the green quadruped looked at him again and nodded once more. Bulba. While everyone seemed surprised to hear this, Ash nonetheless grinned and looked at Pikachu. "I don't know, buddy, you ready for a rumble?" The electric mouse glanced back at his trainer and nodded firmly, smirking and cheeks sparking. "Pika." The boy looked down at Bulbasaur and chuckled, an energetic smile crossing his lips. "All right, Bulbasaur, you got it. We accept your challenge. Let's rock." It was only a short time after this that Ash and Pikachu were soon facing off against the highly spirited grass type. The two soon-to-be battling opponents were facing each other down in the open grassy area between the pond and the cottage. Ash's friends, Melanie and the other Pokémon, were watching them from the sidelines. Acting on his aggressive nature, Bulbasaur started the battle with a tackle attack and ran at Pikachu with intent to win. Luckily though, Ash was ready. Pikachu get out of the way using agility. Demonstrating how lithe and fast he was, Pikachu easily leapt out of the way, but Bulbasaur followed up with a quick razor leaf. Ash was once again quick to counter. Use Iron Tail and knock those leaves away. Tail turning to metal, the electric mouse spun in the air and started smacking each and every razor-sharp leaf away like they were made of mere paper. Then, just as Bulbasaur went charging in for another attack, Ash yelled. Bound up toward that tree above and use it to spring down for a counter-attack. Pikachu waited until just before the grass type was about to hit him and then jumped up. With a quick flip in the air, he slapped the ground with his tail and sent himself rocketing up toward the branch above. As soon as his feet made contact, he launched himself back toward the earth again at rapid speed. Not prepared for the sudden drastic shift in strategy, Bulbasaur was helpless to evade and was therefore clobbered straight on when Pikachu's head collided with his own. The result of this assault sent him reeling back in pain while Ash called for his first Pokémon to use Quick Attack. Taking off in a blurring burst of white energy, Pikachu flew forward and smashed himself once again into Bulbasaur, this time sending him airborne. Bulba! The grass Pokémon cried out just before striking the ground, hard, upon landing. However, true to form, he quickly struggled back to his feet with that same fire of determination in his eyes. Then, without missing a beat, he launched another round of razor leaves at Pikachu, whom defended once again by using the same Iron Tail strategy. Bulbasaur, though, was tricky. Whilst Pikachu was distracted by slapping away the last of the leaves, he managed to sneak his vines in and struck at the opportune moment. Wrapping them around Pikachu's waist, Bulbasaur lifted him into the air and then began slamming him down into the ground over and over again, mercilessly. Ash's friends and Melanie cringed with every hit, but he stayed calm. When the fierce grass type had finally tired himself out from the constant up and down swinging motion of his vines, Bulbasaur was forced to let Pikachu back to the ground. Though he kept his vines wrapped around the hardy little mouse. To the surprise of Bulbasaur, Melanie and the other Pokémon, however, Pikachu slowly rose up onto his feet under his own volition. And, even though battered and bruised from the merciless pounding he had taken, an eerily pleased-looking smile was on his lips. Pika. Even his tone was unnerving. As though every thrashing he had taken only strengthened his resolve and empowered him with a new strength. There most definitely was shock scrawled across Bulbasaur's face, seeing that his opponent was not only still standing after such a beating but was even smirking at him, as though his attacks had only been feather-light touches. Due to this stupor, he was unable to avoid the following assault when Ash called out, "Pikachu, use Thunderbolt." Grabbing hold of the vines that held him, he released a powerful surge of electricity that went straight up through them and started electrocuting Bulbasaur. The other Pokémon's eyes widened and his entire body went rigid as the electrical current went through him like a burnt-out wire, his entire body being illuminated by the bright golden shroud now covering him like a blanket. At last, Bulbasaur simply fell over onto his side, smoke puffing out of his mouth while his motionless position signified defeat. Smirking at the sight, Ash pulled out an empty Pokeball from his cloth belt and enlarged it before tossing the ball straight at his target. As soon as it made contact with Bulbasaur, the device snapped open and sucked him inside before closing back up and dropping to the ground. There, it shook several times before eventually going still as a starburst popped out from the center button, signifying a successful capture. Grinning excitedly, Ash allowed himself to run up and bend down to pick up the ball. Then, striking his signature capture pose, he held it straight up and cheered. "All right. A dream come true, I've got a Bulbasaur. Pikachu pie." Pikachu leapt up and cheered in like enthusiasm with his trainer just before Ash released Bulbasaur from his new Pokeball. He then knelt down and put a gentle hand upon the grass Pokemon's bulb while smiling. "Bulbasaur, I'll make you a promise here and now," he began. "We're gonna work hard together to get strong, and I give you my word now that I'll never leave you like your last trainer did. We're a team now, a family." Pikachu smiled next to the grass type and chirped in agreement. "Pie Pikachu pie." Bulbasaur looked at his teammate and then back at his new trainer before allowing a true smile to cross his lips as he nodded. Bulbasaur. Bulbasaur soar. He never thought that he would give another Pokémon trainer a chance again, but Ash had truly proven himself to be of a very different breed. His actions spoke louder than words, and risking his life to save Bulbasaur and all of the other Pokémon spoke loudest of all. Inside, Bulbasaur knew that he had made the right decision by choosing to trust the messy-haired young rookie. And time would only come to tell just what all would transpire from making that decision. With a warm smile, Ash once more rubbed Bulbasaur's bulb and then went back to join the others with he and Pikachu. In short order, Melanie was assisting him in tending to the mild battle wounds Bulbasaur had sustained during their battle. Afterward, everyone gathered together for a delicious and swiftly prepared meal that Brock soon put together. Once dinner was over and the humans and Pokémon had all eaten their fill, Melanie was discussing a variety of different topics with her new friends. Namely about Pokémon food with Ash and Brock. However, eventually, Bulbasaur soon came up to join them at the steps of the cottage with Oddish and all the other Pokémon in tow. Namely, Paris, Weepinbell, Caterpie, both Rattata and Staryu. Magikarp was quite obviously confined to the pond, but that did not diminish the helpless fish from being present for what was sure to be quite interesting, if the looks on the other Pokémon's faces were anything to go by. "Hey guys, what's up?" Ash asked as he turned and looked down at them. Bulbasaur looked at Oddish and nodded, which caused her to somewhat nervously step forward and look up at Ash before beginning to speak. Oddish Oddish. In order to serve as a translator, Pikachu hopped over and sat down next to the small grass type before communicating with her in their own unique tongue. During this process, Ash could only look on and blink until, finally, Pikachu came hopping back over to him and began relaying what was being said. Pikachu. This he said while gesturing at Oddish and the other Pokémon. Then, to drive his point home, he ran part way up Ash's leg and tapped at the side of his cloth belt which held empty Pokeballs. Finally understanding, his eyes went a little wide and he asked in a stunned tone of voice. "Are you serious?" While Pikachu nodded in the affirmative, his friends and Melanie walked over. "What's going on, Ash?" Misty asked curiously. He turned and looked back at them while gesturing at the Pokémon. Pikachu said that, "They all want to become mine." Their own faces showed the varying degrees of shock they each felt, but Misty was again the one to speak. "You're kidding." He shook his head. "No, they mean it." He looked back at them and asked. "You guys, do mean it, don't you?" The resounding chorus of affirmative calls he received was overwhelmingly convincing, and it caused him to look at his friends again and shrug sheepishly. "Hee, there you go, it's pretty much unanimous, I figure." His expression suddenly changed a bit though as he turned to Melanie. "But hey, are you okay with this, Melanie? I mean, I know this is pretty sudden and unexpected." The blue-haired beauty walked up and knelt down next to Oddish, reaching out to gently rub the Pokémon's head leaves. "Ash, I appreciate your concern, but it isn't my decision to make. The Pokémon I take care of here are not meant to stay forever, they are supposed to someday leave and go back out into the world." She smiled softly down at the grass type now nuzzling into her hand. "Unfortunately, I think I promoted such a pleasant atmosphere here that none of these ever wanted to leave until now. But since they have such a caring and compassionate trainer as yourself willing to take them on, I couldn't be happier." Melanie looked back up at Ash and smiled. "If it's what they want, I am overjoyed for them." With those words said, he smiled and held his arms out. "Well, alright then, I guess that means you all are coming with me. Welcome to the family." He wasn't expecting the veritable stampede of excited Pokémon that suddenly leapt in sheer joy and rushed at him though. This was soon proven in the way they all succeeded in driving him flat to the ground on his back as they glomped him fiercely. Everyone was given a hearty and healthy dose of laughter as they watched the boy struggle under the mob of Pokémon showering their enthusiasm upon him. And when finally they let him up, he stood with a grin plastered on his face. Man, I won't make you guys wait any longer then. With that, everyone stood back to watch the memorable moment as he pulled one Pokeball loose from his belt at a time and knelt down, gesturing each Pokemon forward in turn. Oddish was the first one to step up to him and he smiled kindly at the little grass type before addressing all of them as a whole. Listen guys, since I just filled up my team by catching Bulbasaur, you'll all get teleported away to my hometown once I catch you. A really nice man I know named Professor Oak will take care of you until I make room enough in my current lineup to bring you guys back to me. Is that okay? Receiving nods and calls of agreement, he gestured back at Melanie. Then this'll be the last time you guys see her. You might wanna go say your goodbyes now. He remained where he was and simply watched, along with his friends, Bulbasaur and Pikachu, while the remaining village Pokémon went up to their caretaker and prepared to part ways with her. Oh my little darlings. Melanie knelt down and held her arms out so they could all come into her wide-open embrace. Tears were now filling her eyes as she spoke. I am going to miss you all so much, but I know this is going to be wonderful for you. Ash is a fantastic young trainer and I know he will take good care of you. She allowed her tears to fall freely down her cheeks while the Pokémon themselves let similar sentiments flow. I will always cherish our time together and who knows, maybe someday we'll even meet again. Each of you work hard and never forget that you can all become whatever you set your hearts to. I will always believe in you, I love you all. After sharing a long, heartwarming embrace that caused tears to form also in the eyes of all who were watching, Melanie ended the hug and ushered them all toward Ash with an encouraging, teary smile. Wiping his eyes with his sleeve, the boy smiled brightly at Oddish as the small one came up to him first again. You ready, Oddish? Nodding enthusiastically, Oddish gave a clear and concise, "Odd." Before reaching one of its leaves forward and tapping the empty Pokeball he held in his hand. In a flash of light, the device snapped open and sucked Oddish inside, closing tight again and wiggling a few times before it went still and dinged, a starburst signifying a successful capture. Afterward, Ash held the ball in his hand and waited for a few moments until, soon, it turned white and started to crackle with digital electricity. Then, before everyone's eyes, it simply vanished into thin air, on transit to the Oak Laboratory via cyberspace. Paris came next, slightly timid until Ash just took the nervous bug into his arms and held it comfortingly. Then, in a quick and fluid move, he did the same for it as he had done for Oddish. In short order, both Rattata allowed themselves to be captured, then Caterpie, Weepinbell close behind and Staryu last of all. Once the star-shaped water-type's ball disappeared in the same manner as all the others, he stood up and looked at Misty, grinning all the while. Looks like we'll be trading starfish training secrets, Mist. She shook her head in amusement at his jest and then followed him up to the edge of the pond. Here, Magikarp was eagerly waiting its own turn. Whilst allowing Melanie to say her goodbyes to the seemingly harmless enough fish, Ash looked at Misty as she turned to look at him with a hand on her hip. You know Magikarp isn't going to be an easy Pokémon to train, Ash. Until they evolve into Gyarados you really have to work with them, and even once that happens, it ushers in a whole other set of issues. He shrugged. Yeah, but I'm anxious to try it. After all, Professor Oak always told me that the most unassuming Pokémon can have the biggest surprises in store. Ash then knelt down and, seeing as Melanie had finished with her farewells, he smiled at the bronze fish. You ready to join the family and get strong, Magikarp? Eye-smiling, the hapless carp rapidly flapped its fins while nodding. Carp, carp. Magikarp, carp. Enlarging the empty ball he now held, Ash reached out and touched it to the water-type's forehead. Then welcome to the team. Without so much as a single struggle the Pokeball quickly dinged, signifying a successful capture. Standing up, Ash watched the ball in his hand turn silvery white and crackle with electricity before it too vanished. Chuckling to himself after the fact, he looked up and put his hands to his hips. Hee hee, man, Professor Oak is about to get a couple surprises. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX tea with Delia on the couch in the main, downstairs research area of the laboratory when, suddenly, he received a ding on his computer. One which alerted him to whenever one of his sponsored trainers had captured another Pokémon and it was being sent over to him. Excusing himself, he stood and went over to the teleporter pad that the computer in question was connected to. He had an intuitive feeling that the trainer in question was most likely Ash. The boy had been catching Pokémon in a frenzy, it seemed, and his suspicions were soon proven true. As he watched and waited, the graying-haired Pokémon professional saw first one, followed by several other Pokéballs, all transfer over through the teleportation tube. As each ball materialized on the receiver pad, an image would show up on the screen and reveal via scanning what kind of Pokémon was held within. Samuel Oak's eyebrow raised in a form of curious intrigue as he saw the unusual collection of Pokémon his surrogate grandson had captured. He counted an Oddish, a Weepinbell, Paris, 2 Rattata, 1 Caterpie, a Staryu and even a Magikarp. And since they all came at one time, it was evident that they had been captured almost right alongside one another. Well my, this is quite a surprise indeed. He observed aloud with a smile while lacing his fingers together, elbows resting upon the desk. What is it, Professor? Delia asked as she set her cup down and walked over to get a closer look at the computer. It seems Ash just managed to haul in quite the catch of unique Pokémon, the gray-haired man answered while looking back at her. And all at one time too. Really? The mother's eyes lit up with paternal pride at the mention of her son's success. Oh, I'm so happy for him. Oak nodded and reached out to grab the last Pokeball which had arrived on the telepad. Yes indeed, as am I. He is doing quite well for himself this early into his journey. More so than even his father did when he first started out. However, inwardly, he looked down at the ball he now held in his hand. Knowing that it contained Magikarp, the wizened professor pondered to himself. You and I both know what this one will evolve into, Ash. I am quite interested to see just how you will handle such a challenge when the time comes, especially this early into your journey. Time will indeed tell. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX Ash and his friends were once more prepared to head out on the road. Thankfully, seeing as Melanie herself had to make trips into civilization on occasion, she was able to take them to the main road. Which was not actually all that far from her cottage, a welcome sight to them all to be sure. Melanie, we really appreciate everything you did for us. Ash said gratefully as they stood on the road and made ready to part ways with their host of one night. The kind young woman simply smiled. It was my pleasure. I want to thank you for everything you did, Ash. For protecting us from Team Rocket and for giving the Pokémon I loved so much a great future with a wonderful trainer. I'll be rooting for you in the next Indigo Play-2 tournament. Reaching out to clasp her hand, the boy nodded and returned her smile. Thanks, Melanie, and you don't have to worry. They'll all be safe and happy with me, and grow really strong too. He glanced down at Bulbasaur, whom was standing next to his legs. Right, Bulbasaur. The grass type looked up at them both and I smiled. Bulba. Melanie knelt down and gave his Bulba a light rub. Yes, Bulbasaur, I'm sure you will. After this, Misty, Giselle and Brock gave their own parting farewells to her, the last of whom Misty had to keep from making a blithering romantic fool of himself again before they all set off. However, they didn't get very far before Melanie called out to them, in a humorous tone, while waving. Make sure you keep Bulbasaur out of trouble, Pikachu. The small electric type looked back at the woman from astride his trainer's shoulder and waved back. Pika Pika. Even though Bulbasaur looked up and gave his now fellow teammate a look in which plainly said, as if And while this caused a healthy round of laughter to chorus from the group, they soon turned their attention back to the road. Their eyes set on whatever unique adventure awaited them next. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX Ash, that the traveling group of friends found themselves taking a break underneath a large tree, of which itself was located in a rather spacious field, right off the main road. "Yo Brock, how long until we reach Rolanda town?" Ash asked as he finished taking a drink from the tall, cylindrical, black metal water bottle that he always kept in his pack and filled any time they found a freshwater source. The teenager hummed to himself and pulled out his map. "Well, let's see here. I would say another 2 days and we'll be there probably. That shortcut we took when you led us through the woods actually did turn out to be a time saver after all." The younger boy nodded and then stood up. "Cool. Well guys, I think I'm gonna go train." Giselle finished for him in a cheeky tone. He just gave her a goofy grin in reply. "Maybe." The group receiving a small laugh from the playful exchange, Ash soon went into the field a little further and released his Pokémon. At the moment he had with him Pikachu, Mankey, Cleffa, Bulbasaur and Pidgeotto. He had wanted to keep a space open in his party just in case he ended up catching another Pokémon. The diligent young man had been rotating his Pokémon in and out ever since they left Melanie's cottage 3 days prior, and he had managed to get all of his newest recruits started out on a training schedule, as well as a nutrition plan. Thankfully, the last few days had been kind to him and they all had ample time to train and work together. For Ash, getting their nutrition ironed out was the most crucial because he had to have something to send back to the professor so that he knew how to adequately care for them when they were at the lab. Using his Pokédex, he had also scanned each of his new Pokémon and obtained a thorough grasp on their move sets, abilities and genders. For instance, both of his new Rattata were female. Ash also strongly suspected they were sisters. This he assumed primarily due to 2 main factors. The first being that they were extremely close to one another, neither going anywhere without the other. The second reason was because they both possessed the same ability, which was Guts. They were so identical, in fact, that Ash had to put a pink scarf on one and a purple scarf on the other just so that he could tell them apart. Their move sets were quite impressive as well and also just so happened to be identical. They both knew Quick Attack, Focus Energy, Pursuit, and Hyper Fang. The 2 Rattata sisters showed real promise when training and Ash was very pleased with what he had seen in them thus far. Also, as an interesting spin of developments, in their short time being at the lab and becoming acquainted with Ash's Raticate, the 2 female rodents had reportedly attached themselves to him. In Professor Oak's observation, it seemed they were both a tad smitten with the evolved male. It was due to this that Ash decided to send them back to the lab once he was finished crafting their training and nutrition plans. He felt it would be good for them to be around Raticate, both to learn from him and also to nurture the bond they had started to foster with him. Humorously enough, Professor Oak said that Raticate had apparently not initially known how to handle the close attention he had been receiving from the 2 females. Thankfully though, his awkwardness was apparently beginning to fade and he was becoming more relaxed around them. The next on the list had been Paris and he was a male. He possessed the ability Effect Spore and knew the moves Scratch, Poison Powder, Stun Spore and Leech Life. Ash had been quite impressed with Paris when it came to his training ethics and combat abilities. The small bug, grass type was very good at formulating strategy when battling and he always trained to his full potential. Weepinbell, for his part, was also a male and had the ability Chlorophyll. He knew the moves Vine Whip, Growth, Poison Powder, Sleep Powder, Stun Spore, Sweet Scent and Razor Leaf. A large move set, yes, but expected from a grass Pokémon, whom typically learned new moves quite quickly. Weepinbell was Bulbasaur's more constant sparring partner and was exceedingly motivated when it came to training. Ash had the near-certain suspicion that Weepinbell wanted to make a name for himself and the other members of his evolutionary line. Mostly because both he, as well as his pre- and post-evolved forms, were often overlooked in favor of other, more well-known and desirable Pokémon. This suspicion had been proven true when he asked Weepinbell about it, and the limbless grass type rather passionately affirmed his assumption. Oddish was a female and possessed the ability Chlorophyll. She knew the moves Absorb, Sweet Scent, Poison Powder, Sleep Powder and Stun Spore. The small-statured grass type was a very sweet Pokémon, but she was also serious about training and put her all into practice battling. She looked up to Bulbasaur, that much was clear, and he inspired her to want to become stronger like him. Ash knew that if she persisted, then in time, Oddish would become a skillful and highly adept Pokémon. Caterpie was a male and he had the ability Shield Dust. He knew the moves Tackle, String Shot, and Bug Bite. Also, in a similar fashion as the two female Rattata with Raticate, Caterpie had taken quite a shine to Butterfree during his short stay at Professor Oak's. In fact, after having enough time to work with Caterpie and figure out what training he needed to do, Ash decided to let him stay at the lab so he could work with Butterfree. Since the latter had only recently been a Caterpie himself, Ash felt Butterfree would be able to really boost the other bug types training along. Overall, Caterpie was just like all of his other formerly abandoned Pokémon peers. He wanted to get stronger and he was willing to work as hard as he needed to get there. Interestingly enough, Ash found that he also needed to tie different colored scarves on Butterfree and Caterpie. This was so that when the latter finally evolved into his final stage, Ash would be able to tell the difference between them. Butterfree wore a yellow scarf and Caterpie, a green one. Staryu had the ability Natural Cure and knew the moves Tackle, Water Gun, Rapid Spin, Harden, Recover and Camouflage. Since Staryu and Magikarp were Ash's first Water-type Pokémon, he had Misty give him a few pointers and allowed Staryu to train with Misty's own Staryu and Starmie. He could say that, without a doubt, Staryu was definitely the strongest Pokémon he had acquired at Melanie's, besides Bulbasaur. The Starfish's moveset and ability were very impressive. It was a hard battler and its attacks were indeed powerful. Because of all this, Ash was determined to train Staryu hard since he knew the water type could become a very strong Pokémon. Staryu's training ethic was right up there with the other formerly abandoned Pokémon, so that only made training it a far easier task. Next there was Magikarp and he was a male. He had the ability Swift Swim and knew the moves Tackle, Splash and, very much to Ash's surprise, Flail. It was a rare few Magikarp who knew that move, giving credence to their widely accepted reputation of being useless in battle. Ash could say, with absolute certainty, that Magikarp amazed him. The orange-scaled fish trained fiercely and with a desire to prove itself. He didn't know a lot of moves, so Ash had him work on things like making his Tackle and Flail as powerful as possible and turning Splash into a move that was actually useful. This was done by turning Splash into an evasive movement. Magikarp would essentially use his tail and launch himself in any number of directions in order to avoid incoming attacks. Aside from all this, he also worked Magikarp quite hard on physical conditioning training. Ash would put some of the special shrinkable weights he had on Magikarp, specifically the ones meant for aquatic training, and make him swim for long amounts of time. Doing this worked the determined Carp's stamina, endurance and strength. He would also have Magikarp train on dodging obstacles and or attacks from other Pokémon in the water, thus increasing his agility and speed. This, as well as training with Misty's own water types and Ash's Staryu, helped to gain Magikarp much needed experience and increases in overall power. His ultimate goal in doing all of this was to make Magikarp as strong as possible in his current state so that when he finally evolved into Gyarados, all of that power and experience would transfer over. Ash's hope was that when Magikarp evolved he would be at a point that only his evolutionary state would be able to handle anything more extreme. When he thought about just how strong Magikarp would be as a Gyarados, it left him eagerly awaiting that coveted day of evolution. Both for he and Magikarp. The only problem he had thus far seen with having two water Pokémon was the lack of consistent, large enough ponds, lakes and rivers to train in while on the road. Therefore, after instructing Magikarp and Staryu on what they would be doing for training, he decided to send them back to the lab and allow them stay there for now. That way they would have full access to a constant source of water. The lab's many acres of protected land had quite a few ponds and rivers on the property, which meant Magikarp and Staryu would have plenty of water to train in. Interestingly enough, Professor Oak had recently told him that his Pokémon usually all stayed together around the same area of the ranch. Specifically, it was near one of the forested areas, reasonably close to the lab itself, where the Pokémon had shade in a large pond. One of the widest and deepest bodies of water on the expansive reservation. This was perfect for Magikarp and Staryu, who were able to spend their days training, sparring and enjoying themselves in a place shared by Ash's other Pokémon. The last Pokémon Ash thought about in his current moment of reflection was Bulbasaur. He actually had two abilities. One of which was Overgrow and the other, Chlorophyll. He knew the moves Tackle, Vine Whip, Razor Leaf, Leech Seed, Poison Powder and Sleep Powder. Bulbasaur was truly a one-of-a-kind Pokémon just like Pikachu. He trained just as hard as the electric mouse and that meant right up to the point of collapse. In every manner conceivable Bulbasaur trained himself to the very limit and then pushed past that as far as he could go. He and Pikachu were without a doubt the two Pokémon that trained the hardest, right on the borderline of being unsafe. They had become fast friends and trained together every day. Their spars would oftentimes become so intense that Ash would have to intervene just to keep them from hurting each other. He had decided that, at least for now, he wanted to keep Bulbasaur with him so the hardy grass Pokémon could train under his own critical eye constantly. Ash knew that, eventually, Bulbasaur would become a truly unbeatable powerhouse in battle, just like Pikachu was shaping up to be, if they kept hard at their training. One thing Ash had all of his Pokémon do in training, that would be considered highly controversial by many, was to have them attack each other relentlessly with their most powerful attacks. In this unique, unorthodox and extremely harsh method of training, one Pokémon would do the attacking and the other would simply stand and take it for as long as they could. Using Pikachu and Bulbasaur as an example, the latter would use attacks like Razor Leaf on the former for as long as Pikachu could stand on his feet. Then, after a time of critical rest and recovery, Pikachu would attack Bulbasaur with moves like Thunderbolt at his full power. This too until the grass type collapsed and then it would start all over again. This form of training was similar to Ash's type disadvantage training, only the moves did not have to be type-specific. This style of training was meant to harden and toughen his Pokémon up as much as they possibly could, raising their in-battle endurance and honing their resistance. To summarize it neatly, Ash was trying to teach his Pokémon to not just acclimate to pain in battle but become completely accustomed to it. To take as much punishment as they could handle and then dish it back tenfold. Yes, many would indeed criticize him for the great extremes he took their training to, but Ash was most definitely not heartless. He loved his Pokémon deeply and made sure they never trained to the point of life-threatening danger. He always had medical supplies handy and if things seemed to go too far, he was already ready to step in. Ash had a very simple philosophy. When his Pokémon trained, he trained. And he never asked more out of them than he was willing to give himself. And because of that, he and they bonded not just through emotion but also through sharing the same intensive physical pain and body-breaking conditioning. With his reflection coming to an end, Ash focused on his own training, doubled back to it. Therefore, in only about another hour of hard, grueling work, Ash and his Pokémon finally returned to the others, exhausted and, in his case, soaked in sweat. The Pokémon themselves found new life upon seeing Brock laying out fresh water and food and immediately charged toward him as fast as possible. The squinty-eyed teen saw the ravenous and parched mob of Pokémon coming toward him and tried to throw himself out of harm's way. Sadly, he was unsuccessful and soon found himself getting trampled like weeds on a well-trodden path. As Brock simply lay where he was, twitching, grateful Ash didn't have any large Pokémon yet. The boy in question limped over to where Giselle and Misty were sitting by the road under a tree and crashed on the ground beside them. Grabbing his water bottle, he lifted it to his lips and began to drink while Giselle got a devious smile on her face, seeing an opportunity she simply couldn't pass up. Crawling up to him, she sat down next to the younger boy and then took his head and gently laid it on her lap. He simply looked up at her in confusion at this unexpected action and she merely smiled down at him. It's not good to lay down on such uneven ground, Ash. You could hurt your neck laying like that. Besides, isn't this much more comfortable? The messy-haired trainer thought about it for a moment and just settled for a small smirk. He wasn't a dunce imbecile. He knew what she was doing and he wasn't about to complain. Yeah, you're right, Giselle. This is more comfortable, thanks. As he settled into her lap, she blushed a little and smiled again while beginning to gently run her fingers through his unruly hair, unmindful or at the very least uncaring of his sweat. Misty, though, for her part, looked at the scene with something akin to what seemed to be a mixture of jealousy, disgust and anger before looking away. Next time such an opportunity arose, the redhead mused silently to herself, the older girl would have to be quick on the draw. Because the next lap Ash's head rested in might well just be her own. Especially if she had anything to say about it. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX simply admiring the beauty of the day and their passing surroundings. However, at some point, Pikachu tapped Ash on the head to get his attention. "What is it, buddy?" he asked while looking up to his shoulder. "Pikachu Pika Pie," the electric type responded as he pointed a short ways down the road. Ash followed his Pokémon's line of sight and looked ahead into the near distance. He soon saw what it was Pikachu did, and it caused him to stop mid-step, which also made Brock bump into him from behind. "What is it, Ash?" the older boy asked as he and the girl stopped as well. Instead of replying in words, the young rookie simply pointed at what he was staring at. When the others laid eyes on the unusual sight, a similar expression of shock took residence on their own faces. There, laying atop a large rock near the border of the forest, on the right-hand side of the road, was a Charmander. After staring for a time, Ash and his friends slowly, cautiously, began making their way up to the rock. As they neared the extremely rare, seemingly wild Pokémon, it eyed them warily. "What's a Charmander doing out here in the middle of nowhere?" Misty asked in confusion. "I don't know," Brock replied as they stopped a few feet from the rock. "Maybe it's waiting on something. Or someone," Giselle offered. Ash looked up at the lone Charmander and smiled. "Hey pal, what are you doing out here all by yourself, huh?" The mistrusting Pokémon continued to look at them with that same wary gaze, not making a sound. However, he didn't run away, which was odd. The three starters of Kanto were very rare Pokémon to find in the wild, and anytime they saw people they were usually known to run. As his astute young mind went over all of this for a few moments, a theory suddenly came to Ash and he frowned in disappointment, placing his hands on his hips. "I think it's possible that this Charmander has a trainer, you guys." "What makes you say that, Ash?" Misty asked. The younger boy tilted his head. "Well, for one, if it was a wild Pokémon, then it most likely would have either tried to flee or attack when it saw us. This Charmander didn't do any of that. Clearly it's used to seeing humans and being around them." He scratched his head. "But, it's looking at us with concern. I think it probably means that even though Charmander has a trainer, it doesn't know if we're gonna try and catch it or not." His friends looked back up at the fire type, then with Giselle asking, But why is it here then? Ash simply shook his head. I don't know. It's probably waiting here on command from its trainer for some reason. We should probably leave it in peace then to wait for whoever its trainer is, Brock advised. The other boy nodded. Yeah. It's a shame though. He sighed and put his hands on his hips again. You don't see Charmanders often. I would have liked to have tried to catch it but, oh well I guess. He looked back up at Charmander and smiled. It's probably a great Pokémon and I'm sure its trainer is very proud of it. I just hope he or she comes back soon. I would never leave my Pokémon anywhere like this. You never know what could happen. Brock nodded in understanding. Yeah, but not everyone is as devoted to their Pokémon as you or Ash. Or as overprotective. Giselle teased. He just laughed and rubbed the back of his neck. Yeah, I guess you're right. Well, come on guys, let's get going. With that, they all began walking away from the rock with Ash turning to the lone Pokémon one last time. See ya around Charmander. Take care okay. Pika Pika. Pikachu waved to his fellow Pokémon in farewell as the traveling group got back on the main road and headed their own way. However, even as they gradually began putting more and more distance between themselves and the rock, none of them knew that Charmander had indeed paid attention when Ash made the comment about him being a Pokémon his trainer could probably be proud of. As well as the caring young man declaring that he would never leave one of his own Pokémon alone anywhere to wait for him. With especially those final few words replaying over and over in his head, Charmander looked up toward the sky and cooed sadly. Char. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX came across a somewhat rustic but no less welcoming log Pokémon Center, which was situated right at the corner of the road, bottlenecked at the corner of two stretches of woodland that encompassed the center around on all sides. Upon taking a few moments to admire the sight of the two-level lodgings, they walked inside and found the interior just as cozy as the outside. The center itself was mostly circular in shape with a rounded commonplace meeting area in the center. There were a few tables and seats here and there along the walls, but the sofas themselves were in the common area. The front desk leading back to the medical area was off to the left of the door, and there was also an upper level, which most likely lead to the bedrooms. This level was accessed by a staircase at the far back wall. The most intriguing thing about this center in general was that everything inside was made of finely handcrafted, hand-furnished wood. Something which they all took a few moments to properly admire. After going up and leaving his Pokémon with the on-site Chansey, Nurse Joy was apparently out at the moment. From what they understood, Ash went over to the table his friends had chosen near a window. Sitting down beside Giselle, he simply stared out the window for a few seconds. Rain had begun to fall in torrents and he was beginning to become concerned. Eventually he could take it no more and looked over at Brock. "Hey Brock, do you think that Charmander's trainer ever picked it up?" The older boy's brow furrowed. "I don't know, but I hope so. Otherwise." He paused for a moment. "We all know what happens if a Charmander's tail flame is put out." The young rookie shifted in his seat uncomfortably. "Yeah, I know." Suddenly, they all heard a couple of trainers over in the lounge area laughing and carrying on. "Wow, Damien, you have so many Pokémon," one remarked to a smug-looking blue-haired boy sitting in the center of one of the couches. Said youth had shaggy blue hair that hung down to his neck and he wore glasses atop his head like some kind of hot shot. He was wearing a brown vest with yellow patches on the chest and a pink shirt under that. Just the tuft of what appeared to be a red turtleneck could be seen under that as yet another layer. His legs were adorned by black pants, held fast by a red belt with gold buckle. Attached to the belt was a black holster pouch and his feet were shod with expensive-looking white leather boots. They were all looking at a large collection of Pokeballs that apparently belonged to the one named Damien. The mass of balls having been laid out in one big pile upon the coffee table in front of them. "Yeah, Damien, pretty impressive," another one agreed. The smirking boy simply nodded, his accent as annoying as the sneer on his face. Yeah, it is pretty impressive, ain't it? I'm just a great trainer. What can I say? Hey Damien, didn't you used to have a Charmander too? Another one of his friends asked. He shrugged. Yeah, I used to. Ash's ears immediately perked up upon hearing that. As did his friends, while the snide young man continued. It was so weak though, it lost every battle we ever fought. I got so tired of dealing with it that I left the little wimp on a rock in the forest and told it I'd come back for it. It's probably still back there waiting for me too. He finished with a cruel fit of laughter. As the neglectful and careless trainer laughed along with his cronies at their sick idea of humor, Brock looked over at Ash and saw nothing but cold fury now lighting itself in his eyes as he glared straight down at their table. He was even clenching his fists so tight that his knuckles were turning white. Knowing what happened in Mt. Moon with the Team Rocket members who had caged those Pokémon, Brock was well aware, just like Misty, of how dangerous Ash's temper could be. Strange things happened when he became angered, and Brock was not particularly fond of a repeat occurrence of that unnerving situation. Therefore, he quickly stood up and spoke reassuringly to his friend. Just calm down, Ash, I'll take care of this. He then turned and made his way over to the lounge while Misty got up as well and looked at Giselle. Please stay with Ash and try to keep him calm, okay Giselle? We don't need him blowing his top right now. The other girl looked confused, but Misty just waved her hand. I'll tell you later. Just, please stay here and try to keep him calm, okay? Giselle merely nodded, her confusion not abated in the least. Yeah, sure Misty, I will. The orange-haired girl gave a small smile of thanks and then looked at Ash once more, hesitantly, before following after Brock. Giselle turned back to Ash and saw him now breathing relatively hard, his gaze still twisted in anger and his fists clenched tight. She could have sworn that she saw a faint blue glow surrounding him for a moment, but she dismissed it and took his clenched hand in hers. In as gentle a manner as possible, she caressed his and spoke in a soothing tone. It's okay Ash, please calm down. Brock and Misty will take care of it, so don't worry about a thing. Alright. The arrogant young man and his friends were still laughing even when Brock and Misty came up to the table. Damien saw them approach and asked rudely, what do you two want? Brock just looked at him intently, his tone matching the firmness on his face. Is that your Charmander we saw on the way here who was sitting on that rock waiting for its trainer? The other boy just snorted. And what if it is? It's none of your business, Squinty. At that, Brock reached down and grabbed the boy roughly by his shirt, lifting him up off the couch and onto his feet. That Charmander has been out there waiting for you all day. Now it's out there in a thunderstorm, and if its tail flame goes out, it'll die. Go and get it. What kind of trainer are you anyway? Misty demanded angrily from beside Brock. Nobody with a heart would abandon their Pokémon period, but to do it the way you did is just sick and cowardly. The young man, nonplussed, merely smirked and then motioned with his hand. Suddenly, Misty was lifted off of the ground by one of his cronies, grabbing her up under the arms as if in a headlock, while Brock was tackled to the ground by two others, causing him to drop Damien. The one boy held Misty tightly by her underarms and the other two kept the struggling Brock down on the ground, one pinning each arm. Damien, appearing supremely satisfied with himself, smoothed out his vest and then walked up to the grounded Brock. Every other person in the Pokémon Center was simply looking on at the scene with bated breath, all of them hoping someone would step in and end it. Nurse Joy was not even present, having gone out to check on a supposedly injured Nidorino, which had apparently been seen by someone limping around on a wounded leg. Damien flipped his hair, still smirking, and motioned for his boys to lift Brock to his feet. Once they did, he simply leaned in and sneered. That Charmander was weak and a waste of my time. It ain't your business what I do with my own Pokémon, so butt out. If that little runt dies, it dies. With that, he reared back and then punched Brock in the gut, hard, causing the former gym leader to double over and gasp for air. Damien then yanked the older boy back up to face him by the hair. If I ever see your face round here again, I'll have my boys beat ya until you're begging for mercy. You got that? As a final threat, he brought a fast uppercut down from below and caught Brock in the face, causing spit to fly from the Pokémon breeder's mouth as Damien's thugs let him go and allowed him to topple to the floor. Finally, the blue-haired degenerate turned to Misty, who was still being held tight by the boy behind her. Now what do we do with you, darlin'? Even as Brock tried to get back up, a swift kick to the gut by another of the boys sent him crumpling back to the ground again. Simultaneously, the one pinning Misty's arms in the air with his hands locked down over her neck laughed at his leader. I think we should teach this one a little lesson, boss. Maybe make her an example for everyone here to see. The boy who had just kicked Brock nodded, a lascivious grin forming on his face as he looked the squirming girl up and down. Yeah, show 'em all why you don't mess with us. She's skinny, but I bet she looks a lot better without those clothes on. Their intentions very clearly exposited. Misty's eyes widened and her struggling renewed, only matched by the fury coming from her mouth. Let me go, you cowards, and I'll teach you a thing or two. I'll make you sorry you were ever even a gleam in your parents' eyes. Damien snickered in derision and began closing in on her, along with the other two. I think that's a pretty stellar idea, let's do it. Before any of them could so much as take one step closer to Misty, however, everyone suddenly heard a loud crash from the other side of the room. Turning, all eyes in the building sought out the source of the commotion and saw Ash now standing up from the table. The crashing sound had been the noise of the young man in question literally flipping the entire thing upside down and was now standing there, his breaths coming hard and heavy. His enraged gaze was locked firmly upon Damien and his crew, and his eyes were now glowing a bright, terrifying and most definitely unnatural electric blue. More so even than that, Ash's entire body was now shrouded in a veil of sparking, crackling energy that bore the same color as his eyes. It was like the incident at Mt. Moon all over again, only this time far more intense and greatly magnified. Giselle was still in her seat, staring at Ash with wide eyes of shock and fear, as was everyone else in the room. The lights in the Pokémon Center began flickering and the flames in the fireplace near the back wall were faltering, as if some invisible force was trying to snuff them out. The air itself became so thick that it was hard to breathe, and even the atmosphere seemed to visibly darken. Slowly, almost as if he were levitating, Ash began walking over toward the rowdy bunch of miscreants, the lights overhead dimming and nearly going out completely as he passed beneath each one. His burning blue eyes were